I'm Michael Murphy. I direct the Hank Center here. And on behalf of our staff, Megan, Emily, Kate, Justina was here, Joe, and Mark, and Kathleen McNutt, we want to welcome you again, and we're happy you're here. I'd like to thank my staff in advance, our staff, because without this crackerjack staff, we don't get to have this lovely room. And really, much of the programming, a lot goes into it. I'm sure you know that. So I want to thank them. If you wouldn't mind, just a little round of applause for them at the beginning. Appreciate it. I also want to thank the Hank family for providing a generous endowment to the university to support this programming. So we thank the Hank family as well. Also, as far as I'm thanking people, I want to thank two special people, Dr. Ellie Shermer, who's here, and Dr. Michelle Nickerson, who's here. We've worked on the 68 series since last spring. We did an event on Humana Vitae at 50, and then carried on with a week with Daniel Berrigan and William Stringfellow, looking at kind of the politics of conscience and friendship, a whole week. Michelle really helped with that. And then Ellie and Michelle, we've done everything together, but Ellie may have helped more with this, and Michelle more with Berrigan Week, but we all were collaborating the whole time with all these events, helping and inviting people. So it's been a real pleasure to work with Dr. Shermer and Dr. Nickerson from history. I just have brief remarks, and Michelle's going to say a couple words about today. So 68, there's just an invitation to mark this 50-year look back. So much has happened. I think the first way into it for me was to think how much 2018 rhymes with 1968 in certain ways. 2018 is quite a year, and the years just preceding it, and I know it's we're carrying that weight, almost making us all kind of threadbare, no matter what your location is. 1968, you take one look at the events, and Father Regan tomorrow night is going to speak a bit about this as he introduces our keynote, Julian Borg from Boston College. If you look at what happened in 1968, it's just overwhelming. And I thought this morning, like, if we had the hyperactivity of social media in 1968, I don't know if it would have made it through the year. It's just so much was happening, and now we realize more and more how close we are, and every event gets a reaction, and we're all tied in this loop. So it really is quite something for humans to navigate through. Just a couple high marks from the year. I would just say that the year kicks off with a group, Dr. Spock, Benjamin Spock, remember him? And Mitchell Goodman, who's the husband of one of my favorite poets, Denis Levertov. They are disrupting draft processes, and they're arrested in, I think, New York in January 5th. And most of them are indicted, convicted, I think, in June. And then all kinds of civil rights activity. One that doesn't get a lot of play is that bowling alley situation in North Carolina, college students protesting segregated bowling alleys, and 3 of them were killed in this protest in 68. The Prague Spring in 68, that's a whole other, click on that one, but more. And then Paris in 68. Between all that, it's Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy, two months apart, assassinated. That will destabilize a world. The hunger strike of Cesar Chavez in solidarity and leadership as a public theologian, I would say he is, with the United Farm Workers in California and beyond after. That's just really gets us to June and more besides. A couple other kind of facts about 68. It's the year that Intel was founded, the semiconductor chip maker, and that forecasts a whole other revolution, a whole other sea change. The biggest sea change, I think we can agree, since probably Gutenberg's printing press in 1432, the digital revolution. And then the photo from Apollo 8 of that Earthrise. And I think to myself, man, what a fragile place. So Michelle Nickerson.
Thank you very much, Mike. First, I want to thank you again for joining us and thank the Hank Center for hosting this event. It's really a pleasure to be part of this team that put it together. As we were thinking about what we were going to do this year, I wanted to mention kind of how this evolved. And basically, several of us were talking about Berrigan Week, as we called it, and the Catholic resistance of 1968. But especially in conversation with Dr. Shermer, it became clear that we couldn't just limit ourselves to those events, that we really had to address the much broader circumstances of the year, of the epic. It's interesting that the Beatles released a song shortly before 1968 that started with the words, "I heard the news today, oh boy." And it's interesting how that phrase itself could be so appropriate for much of history, but especially 2018. It's an opportunity for us to revisit especially the fury of that period, fury over the assassinations at the government because of the war, fury at protesters. This was also, I thought, a way for us to talk about the polarization of our own time period. On the one hand, we saw the deepening cynicism of the electorate that came to increasingly believe that our problems were not going to be solved through the mechanics of the American democratic system. But on the other hand, incredible passion and hope and effort to make those transformations happen nevertheless. And so with one eye on the past and one eye on the present, we realized that there was quite a bit we could use and think about from 1968 for our moment. The other reason we wanted to expand on October's events is because it was also clear that we needed to reflect on the global nature of these transformations. The issues that galvanized activists in the United States were animating activists in Mexico, France, Germany, and other parts of the world, Czechoslovakia. And so we've since developed perspectives on that tumult, using the decades in between to evaluate enduring consequences. Maybe as we dive into 1968 and think about its legacies, we can find ways to use these insights to judge and navigate our present. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce the moderator for our first panel, Elliot J. Gorn, who is the Joseph Gagliano Professor of American Urban History at Loyola. And per his request, I'm not going to use anything else to introduce him. With that, I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Gorn.
As my daughter says, the man who needs no introduction. This is an exciting symposium, and our particular topic, resistance and riots, murders and martyrs, comes on a day when bombs are sent to political opponents of those in power. So maybe there are some resonances here to be noted. One thing that I thought of, I'll say this very briefly, but just because something I was writing recently was on my mind, how pervasive, we talk about the 60s and the ethos and things that happened in the 60s. And in our own day, athletes taking a knee in the NFL. And I, of course, being me, think back to Muhammad Ali, the heavyweight champion of the world, who loses his title because in 1966 he decides that, no, since I'm being drafted, I will not go to Vietnam. And his thinking evolves on it. You can watch him, his thinking evolve on it, but his title is stripped away by various athletic associations, the Houston Draft Board, where he refused to take that step forward and enter into the war, a war that he described as a war of white men sending black men to kill yellow men. Ali, who said of America's enemy, who we perceived as our enemy, the Viet Cong, I got no quarrel with them Viet Cong. Ali lost his title, didn't fight his prime years, went on college campuses like this one and spoke before student audiences until the Supreme Court finally decided unanimously that the decision of the Houston Draft Board, the procedures were improper, and they reinstated, they threw out his case, and he was reinstated and again fought for his title for the next several years. So even in something like boxing, like the sporting world, 1968 pervaded everything. We're going to change the order just a little bit. First, Don Steeman from Loyola is going to go first, and he's going to talk to you. Can you hear me? Is this okay? This could be a... Wish we were closer. He's going to talk to you about violence and vengeance, U.S. responses to crime and violence since the 1960s. And just to tell you a little bit about him, he's associate professor of and chair of the Department of Criminal Justice and Criminology here at Loyola. Received his PhD from NYU in 2007, and he's currently working on a project on prosecutorial decision-making and racial disparity under a grant from the MacArthur Foundation. So, Professor Don Steeman.
I have to figure out how to get my presentation up here. Let's see. Maybe it's down here. There it is.
You want a handheld mic?
No, I'm okay. Can you hear me if I step up a little closer? Thank you. I always like to start by lowering expectations. So I am not a scholar of the 60s. I'm not a historian. I actually know very little about the 60s. But it is kind of interesting for someone who studies crime and responses to crime. 1968 as itself was not a particularly violent year in the context of the next 30 years. But what's interesting for me as someone who studies responses to crime, 1968 is actually a landmark year for many criminal justice policies, and it actually set the tone for much of our responses to crime over the next 40 years. And what happened recently in the 2016 presidential election, and it continues to, much of the rhetoric that was there in 1968 during the presidential campaign, you could hear again in 2016, and you can continue to hear this year in the way the administration talks about crime, the way they link immigration to crime, and the law and order approach that they're taking to criminal justice issues. So it's more interesting for me to think about 1968 in the way that crime and responses to crime were politicized, how the federal government became more involved in issues of crime starting in 1968, and how the responses to crime in 1968 really kind of set the tone for the punitive approaches we had over the next few years. There are a few themes that we should think about from 1968 around crime and responses to crime. One, the issue of increasing violent crime rates. 1968 was certainly not the end of the rise in violent crime rates, but it was near the beginning, and people were aware of it. Increasing citizen concern about crime and violence for the first time. Large percentages of the population described crime and violence as one of the most important issues facing the country. Federal attention to the crime problem in a new way. It's the first time the federal government decided it was going to get involved in local crime issues. And the politicization of crime in a new way, particularly among Republicans in driving to the Nixon's campaign. So I just want to show some numbers. I can't give a presentation without showing lots of graphs, so I apologize for those who don't like graphs. This is the violent crime rate in the 1960s. So between 1960 and 1968, the violent crime rate in the United States increased about 88%. The largest increase really started between 1964 and 1968. So in a 4-year period, violent crime in the United States went up precipitously. And it was all crime types: murder, robbery, sexual assault. Although we don't have comparable data, say, before 1960, homicide rates up until 1960 had been pretty flat since the 30s. So the U.S. had experienced a pretty long period of flat crime rates in the United States where things were pretty stable. However, in the mid-1960s, violent crime rates started to go up. If we think about Chicago as just a good example, this is a graph of the number of homicides that happened in Chicago during the 1960s. In 1968, there were 275 more murders in 1 year than there were in 1960. Most of that increase, again, came between 1965 and 1968. In that 4-year period, there were 250 more murders in 1968 than there were in 1965. That's an average of 85 more murders every year. And Chicago wasn't alone. Most other urban areas were experiencing similar rises in homicides. If we just look at like the national trend, this is the homicide rate during the same period, you can see Chicago looked like the nation, right? All big cities were seeing large increases in crime. New York City was, Detroit, Philadelphia, Chicago. And this, again, with the rising violent crime rate, had many people concerned. This, the orange line here represents the percent of the population who described crime and violence as the most important problem facing the nation. Between 1960 and 1966, about 1.5% of people polled in the Gallup poll said crime and violence was the most important problem facing the country. In 1967 and 1968, that jumped to an average of 17%. In 1968, is the highest point it had ever come during the Gallup polling. 19% of the population thought that crime and violence were the most important issues facing the country. At the same time, people were starting to get concerned about violence. We see an uptick in the number of new handgun purchases during the decade, right? 1960 to 1964, somewhere around 600,000 new handguns were entering the market every year. By 1967 and 1968, 2.5 million new handguns were purchased in the United States during that time. Some of that is a reaction to the upcoming presidential election. Some of it is a reaction to the Johnson administration's approach to gun crime. The Gun Control Act came out in 1968. As that buildup happened, people were purchasing guns. It also might be a reaction to the rising violent crime rate during the period. If we put it all together, 1968 looks like there's a lot going on. Violent crime was the highest it had been in the decade, actually the highest it had been in several decades. The citizens were more and more concerned about gun violence and saw it as increasingly problematic, and more people had guns. There were more guns on the street. That looks a lot like a crisis happening in 1968. Not to give away the punchline later, violence in 1968 was not that high, given what it did over the next 3 decades, right? I'll show you a graph later. It's minuscule relative to what it was by the 1990s. Citizens' perceptions of crime as a problem, 19%, it's pretty high. It hit 35% by the mid-1990s, right? So people were concerned, but not as concerned as they would be later. The purchase of handguns continued to increase after this too. What's interesting about 1968, though, is the response, the political response to perceived rising violence, to concerns of citizens. So several things happened in 1968 that set the stage for our approach to crime and criminal justice in the United States for the next 40 years. President Johnson in 1965 had declared a war on crime. By 1968, his commission, the Commission on Law Enforcement and the Administration of Justice, had released its report, The Challenge of Crime in a Free Society, where they made several recommendations for changes to local approaches to criminal justice. A few of the things that came out of these, both the Law Enforcement Assistance Act, the Challenge of Crime in the Free Society, and the Omnibus Crime Bill of 1968, was really actually the culmination of Johnson's commission on war on crime, was a lot more money being given to local law enforcement agencies. A proliferation of money under the Law Enforcement Assistance Act that went to buying things like bulletproof vests, helicopters, armored personnel carriers, rifles, gas masks, military equipment for law enforcement, primarily to deal with civil unrest in urban areas, student unrest, but a lot of money flowing to local law enforcement primarily to buy equipment. The Crime Commission and its recommendations in Challenge of Crime in a Free Society were actually based on a lot of the sociological theories at the time around the causes of crime. Many of their recommendations were targeted at the root causes of crime, poverty, education, segregation in urban areas. And many of their recommendations were an attempt to combat that, getting community and police to work together better to address crime issues. Most of that, however, was left out of the Omnibus Crime Bill. What the crime bill did, again, was argue for better training of police, which was good. It's about professionalizing the police force. It did call somewhat for community policing, but what it did was, again, put a lot of money into local law enforcement agencies through block grants and allow local jurisdictions to determine for themselves how they would spend the money. Spend a lot of money on militarizing the police. So the primary critique of the omnibus crime bill now is that it really set up a system of us against them, for lack of a better way to think it. It elevated the victim to a very important status, and it elevated the police to an important status as well. It created a zero-sum game between, say, police and victims and criminals. And as the end of the due process revolution of the 1960s, this was a reaction to that too. It was a reaction to the civil rights movement as much as it was a reaction to crime that was happening in urban areas. And what the omnibus crime bill did was really set up this idea that victims needed to be protected and that the police should be seen as heroic and supported in fighting this crime problem. What also happened in 1968 was Richard Nixon's presidential campaign took a new approach to thinking about crime. Right, Nixon called for a law and order approach to crime during his political campaigns. He said at one point, America has become among the most lawless and violent nations in the history of free people, weakening the peace forces against the criminal forces. And what he called for was not Johnson's war on crime that was going to address the root causes of crime, but a new war on crime that saw criminals not as, or crime not as the product of the social environment, but as the choices of individuals. His campaign linked race and crime together. The Southern strategy, which many people talk about, it was a way to mobilize Southern whites to vote Republican, and that was done through focusing on crime issues, particularly urban crime issues. Excuse me. Sorry, my notes are all over. I should have organized this a little bit more before I came. Right, the idea was that it made crime not about inequality, but about a lack of social control. It didn't have to be that way, right? We could have approached crime from a social perspective and saw crime as coming out of the social inequality that existed in the United States. Issues of poverty, lack of education, segregation, lack of job opportunities in particular communities. And we could have addressed it through improving those things in neighborhoods. But what we did instead was look at crime as a social control issue, and that people committed crimes because there wasn't enough social control in society. And what Nixon's administration did was argue for more control. Right around particularly issues of street crime. And it tried to address specific issues of violence. This really set the stage for what happened in the next 40 years. Because crime continued to go up, people realized that law and order in politics won elections, so they argued for it more. And it introduced what some have called governing through crime, which I'll talk about in a minute. So there are a few themes in post-1968 that are very similar to the themes in 1968. What happened over the next 40 years were persistently high crime rates, decline of what we call the rehabilitative ideal in the criminal justice system, that we weren't here to help people, we were here to punish people, hence the title of my thing about vengeance. Persistently high incarceration rates, which are a result of that, and a continued use of crime and responses to crime in politics. Just to give you an idea what it looked like after that, as I said, violent crime in 1968 was higher than it had been for decades. That shows you what it looked like in 1968. Over the next 25 years, violent crime continued to go up. It went up 154% between 1968 and 1991 when it peaked, right at a rate of over 750 violent crimes per 100,000 people in the population, well above what it was at about 300 crimes per 100,000 population in 1968. So violent crime continued to go up. What had been the stage that had been set in 1968 with Nixon's campaign and even the omnibus crime bill was that the only way we could address that was through more social control. So we continued to think that the only way to combat this is more police, more punishment, more prisons. It has gone down quite a bit. And just to put this into context of how 2018 is very similar to 1968, right? The crime rate now is higher than it was in 1968, but it's the lowest it's been in the last 25 years. right? 1991 was the peak of this. We are approaching crime rates that were similar to what we had in the early 1970s. So in 1968, we thought crime was horrible. Now we think it's probably okay, right? We're getting back to where we were 50 years ago, and we should feel relatively safe, at least compared to how unsafe we were in 1991. There are a few things that happened, though, in response to this. As violent crime continued to increase, and we had already decided that social control was going to be our approach, we decided that rehabilitation, which had dominated our approach to criminal justice through most of the 20th century, was not a good idea anymore. In 1974, there was a famous article called What Works? And the response was nothing works to rehabilitate people. Instead, we switched to incapacitation, deterrence, and largely punishment. And we thought that was the best way to respond to people who committed crimes from the 1970s until now. We're starting to come out of it a little bit. With that came a new focus on consistency, proportionality, and accountability in criminal sentences. What we get through the 1970s are mandatory sentencing policies, 3 strikes laws, habitual offender laws, right? Anything that's going to, extensions of sentences for people convicted of crimes. If the goal here is to punish, not to rehabilitate, then we should punish really harshly. And we should make sure that the people we send to prison stay there a really long time. There's also an increased concern with crime prevention and public support for police and victims. We see that through the naming of laws now. Megan's Law, Jessica's Law, right? These are an attempt to equate crime with victims, to elevate victims to a special place in society. And again, unquestioning support for police. We see that still now, although we might wonder whether it's starting to crack. Right? The Black Lives Matter movement, Colin Kaepernick and people who protested in the NFL are trying to draw attention to police abuses in urban areas. But we still see things like what happened in Chicago last week, where an officer who shot an unarmed teenager was required to get his job back after he'd been fired by the superintendent of police. So there's still a strong public support for police and victims. What also happened was a new concern with what we call risk containment. Right, what happened was through most of the last 40 years, we focused more on containing risk by incapacitating people. We didn't send people to prison to help them. We sent them there simply to keep them off the streets, and that was seen as the best way to prevent violence. So what do we get for that? This is going to be a graph of the incarceration rate in the United States. In 1968, we were doing pretty good. Incarceration rates were pretty low. There was a famous article that came out in the mid-1970s that talked about the stability of imprisonment, right? The idea that for most of the 20th century, we maintained an incarceration rate that was about 100 per 100,000, and it had been stable for a really long time. It may not be a surprise that the policies we started in the 1960s changed that. Between 1968 and 1991, again, that was the peak of the violent crime rate, we'd increased incarceration rates by 232%. By 2008, at the peak, we had increased incarceration rates much more. It started to come down now. We're in a bit of a downturn in incarceration, but still historically high rates. A 438% increase from 1968 to 2008 when we peaked in the incarceration rate in the United States. Right, so what we set in motion in 1968 with the Omnibus Crime Bill and a law and order approach or social control approach to crime led to an incarceration rate that dwarfs any other country in the world and certainly looks out of place historically for the United States. And what it led to, what many sociologists argue it led to, was what we might consider governing through crime. A couple pieces of that, the federalization of the criminal law. The federal government is more and more involved in crime than it was ever in the past. Crime and crime control now are central features of politics. Politicians continue to run on tough on crime attitudes or policies. People are ridiculed for being soft on crime or for not taking a tough enough approach. But what's more important, and what some sociologists argue is happening, is references to crime control now legitimize government actions in many social institutions. What we mean by that is crime's not just a strategic issue that can be raised, but we deploy this category of crime control to legitimize interventions in all kinds of different ways. So things like the arguments for guns in classrooms is legitimate because it protects children. Warrantless searches of cell phones and emails are legitimate because they protect us against terrorists. Stop and frisk in racial profiling is legitimate because it protects us against gun violence in the cities. We even see it justifying other things as far as technology. We see metal detectors in schools, police in schools, chain link fences around schools, zero tolerance in schools, and they're legitimized because they're seen as protecting us. The idea is that this reference to crime that started in the late 1960s now pervades most social institutions in our approaches to social control in all different kinds of environments. So I want to end with where are we now? Violent crime rates are now at levels that we haven't seen since 1970. We're a far less violent country than we were in 1991. The city of Chicago, which experienced historic spikes in murders a few years ago, is safer than it was in 1991. The number of murders in some cities are at 50-year lows. New York City has experienced homicides last year at the lowest rate since the early 1960s. Incarceration rates are now at a 20-year low, and although we saw a little uptick last year on a downward trend. However, the 2016 campaign of Donald Trump makes crime and violence the focus of presidential campaigns again. Both President Bush and President Obama had taken progressive approaches to crime and criminal justice issues. The Second Chance Act that was signed by President Bush was an effort to help people re-enter society after going to prison. President Obama tried to undo the war on drugs as best he could through federal legislation and through and through letting people out of prison who had been there for drug crimes. But the campaign in 2016 introduced a new law and order approach to crime. It now links race, immigration, and crime in new ways that hadn't been done before. It uses the rhetoric of war, safety, and elevates victims in a way that we haven't seen since the 1960s, and that many criminologists thought we had left behind in the early part of the 20th century. As mass incarceration got so big, both conservative and liberal politicians saw that our policies hadn't worked, that it wasn't the massive use of incarceration that drove down crime, it was other social policies that were doing it, and that we were spending a great deal of money to impose a lot of harm on individuals. So from violence to vengeance, the idea is this, right, that small uptick in violence in the late 1960s, that small increase in the perceptions of people around crime and violence issues led to 4 decades of criminal justice policy that was draconian, that was meant to be punitive, and that led to massive use of incarceration in the United States. Thank you.
Kathleen, can I introduce you?
Oh, yeah.
Just so
Sorry.
people who know who you are.
Being efficient.
Oh, that's not it. I'm going to let you find it.
All right. Thanks, Professor Steeman. Professor Kathleen Ballou of the University of Chicago, a historian, a recent American historian at the University of Chicago, published very recently her first book, Bring the War Home, The White Power Movement and Paramilitary America, published by just this year, Harvard University Press, to really rave notices, and an interview on the Terry Gross's show on Fresh Air. I envy you. And she is going to talk to us about the subject of her book, the Vietnam War and the White Power Movement. And I think it'll touch base with Professor Ballou's talk will touch base in some ways with what Professor Steeman talked about in terms of, well, kind of bringing race into crime.
Thank you. Sure. Thanks. How's the volume in the back? Okay? Okay, so as Elliot mentioned, my book and my talk today are both about the impact of the Vietnam War on white power violence in the United States. Surprising nobody in this room, I imagine, this often is described as a later term story, but in fact has deep roots in 1968. So the title of my book, Bring the War Home, is taken from a essay volume, Essays of a Klansman, written by Louis Beam, who served 2 tours in Vietnam before returning to the United States in 1968, and creating what would become the white power movement largely on his war memories. So, as I said, returns in 1968. He uses the Texas Veterans Land Grant to buy acreage in a place called Double Bayou, Texas. And there he builds a paramilitary facility that he's going to use to turn Klansmen into soldiers. He chooses as his enemies local Vietnamese refugees who have been resettled on the Texas coast. And attacks them largely using the uniforms, weapons, and apparatus, ideological apparatus of the Vietnam War. So doing things like igniting a boat painted USS Viet Cong. It's worth noting that the people who were resettled as refugees are not Viet Cong. And in fact, many of the people who resettled on the Texas coast were there precisely because they'd been American military allies in the war in Vietnam. Now, let me just step back for a minute and talk about why I'm using the term white power and what I'm talking about in this movement. So the white power movement is an alliance of a whole bunch of different kinds of groups. It's ideologically diverse. It is not interested in diversity, but it is ideologically diverse. It included people ranging from skinheads to Klansmen to radical tax protesters to white separatists to followers of white theologies, including Christian identity and Odinism. As you can see in the sticker catalog from 1989, these groups used a common set of symbols and often moved between these ideologies. This should be thought of as flexible sorts of belief systems, such that people could really easily move between beliefs and groups. People have sometimes used the phrase white nationalist to talk about this movement. I don't like this at all. It is correct from a political science perspective, but when we think about white nationalist, the thing that comes to mind for a lot of people is sort of an overexuberant patriotism, which is to say that the nation that's assumed to be in white nationalist is the United States, right? You might think of earlier iterations of the Klan more closely fit this idea of white nationalism. Historians in the room will be familiar with the pictures of the Klan in the 1920s marching on the mall in Washington, D.C., wearing their robes and hoods, but with their faces unmasked, right? Carrying American flags and sort of claiming 100% Americanism as their own political platform. That's been enormously successful for the Klan, and indeed that iteration of the Klan was the largest in American history. But this isn't that. From 1983 forward, the national implied in white nationalism has to do with a transnational alliance of white people. The nation is the Aryan nation, and the end point that's imagined by this movement is the overthrow of the United States and the establishment of an all-white country and world. So when we say white nationalism, I think it creates some discursive slippage away from the very radical idea that this is. This is about white power activism. Increasingly, this movement saw the state as its enemy and organized to carry out a race war, one that was designed to overthrow the federal government. And they also, along the way, plotted and carried out a wide variety of illegal actions targeting civilians, including assassinations, poisoning water supplies, infrastructure attacks, what am I forgetting? Counterfeiting and bank robbery. There's a whole slew of illegal actions carried out by the movement. I really like what you said about the 50-year rhyming of 2018 and 1968. That's such an interesting way to think about it because as a historian, we of course want to draw complexity into our conversation and think about the many differences. But there are these connotations and resonances that I think are really compelling ways to think about the present political moment. So thinking about this movement causes us to think about the long 1960s and the way that people who lived through that time reaped the whirlwinds of 1968 in the decades that followed. So the movement that I'm describing here came together at the end of the 1970s, but using the infrastructures and ideas of this earlier time, and in many ways reacting to the political changes that were set in motion and really realized and crystallized in the end of the 1960s. These include the sort of the wake of the lost Vietnam War, the major economic turmoil set off in the early 1970s, the distrust of institutions and loss of faith in the state that characterized that time for many people, immigration, farm crisis, the loss of jobs to overseas factories. And it's worth thinking about the fact that these concerns are familiar, right? These concerns also impacted a lot of people who joined other kinds of social movements and other kinds of formations on the left and on the right. The white power movement formed with an event very much, well, let me just say first, when I talk about the Vietnam War impacting this movement, I'm thinking about it in a number of different ways. There's a very direct way that the Vietnam War worked to bring these activists together who, prior to this moment, didn't have very much in common. And they talk about it this way. Klansmen talk about being patriotic. They self-define as patriotic. And people who fought in World War II against Germany talk about in the 1970s and 80s how hard it is to sit down in a room with neo-Nazis, how hard it is to adopt the swastika as one of these flexible symbols of the movement. But after the Vietnam War, there's a sense of betrayal by the state and a sense of wrongness of the conflict that are so intense that they create a narrative that can bring together these disparate groups under one banner. And you can see that it even goes so far as, this is a little, sorry, it's a little bright. This goes so far as shaping even their public-facing actions. So here's a man on the right wearing a Klan hood made out of camo fatigue uniforms. We see this throughout the movement where people adopted camouflage fatigues. Oh, here's the USS Viet Cong. People adopted camouflage fatigues as well as the white robe and hood, as well as SS uniforms that are more reminiscent of World War II. But you can see that Vietnam is shaping not only the parameters for coming together, but also the symbolic universe and cultural imaginary that animates this activism. The other thing it does is dramatically escalate the impact of white power movement violence against civilians when they do carry out violence, because now this movement is shaped by a number of instrumental veterans and active duty military personnel who are familiar with the methods of killing that they've learned in Vietnam and afterward. And the movement during the time that I study does things including but not limited to manufacturing their own Claymore-style landmines, training in urban warfare, and obtaining stolen military weapons and material from Fort Bragg, among other military institutions. So this movement really comes together at the end of the 1970s in Greensboro, North Carolina, which is the event that sort of drew me to this story to begin with. In 1979, a group of neo-Nazis and Klansmen opened fire on a leftist demonstration held by a group that was called the Communist Workers' Party. They opened fire on this demonstration. They killed 5 people, 4 of whom were white men. So already this event doesn't fit into our narrative of the 1960s very well, right? It's late for civil rights era violence. The victims are not who you might expect for civil rights era violence, and certainly for people who are killed by the Klan. And this is how I got into the book. They held a Truth and Reconciliation Commission about this event in Greensboro in 2005. This body had no subpoena power, no punitive power, no city buy-in. It was purely an NGO truth commission, one of the only ones in the United States to really begin to grapple with our legacy of racial violence. And the thing that people kept saying in front of this truth commission when they came to testify either as perpetrators of the event or as people affiliated with Klan and neo-Nazi activism was, well, I killed communists in Vietnam. Why wouldn't I kill communists here? This is a profound collapse of meaning. This collapses Homefront and peacetime. Homefront and battlefront. This collapses peacetime and wartime, and it also collapses different kinds of communist enemies writ large. As I began to look at the massive archive produced by the movement, this idea turned out to be a central and critical theme. And indeed, the Vietnam War appears as the glue that holds these groups together. It also led me to realize that despite many misconceptions to the contrary, and I think you can see the echo of this in our present moment as well, this isn't about lone wolf violence. This is about a social movement that connected people in all regions of the country, across genders, across class backgrounds, across urban, rural, and suburban space, and mobilized very effectively in part through its many deliberate strategies that sought to obscure itself as a social movement. So the loose timeline of the book has to do with the formal unification of white power activism in Greensboro in 1979, the revolutionary turn when the movement declared war on the federal government in 1983. There's a militia outgrowth phase in the early 1990s. And then the movement reached its most significant mass casualty event to date in the bombing of the Oklahoma City in 1995, which killed 168 people, including 19 young children. Yes. So if you remember nothing else about this today, thinking about the 1960s and the sort of long legacy of how we might think about history as impacting later events, I think the main thing about this is that the war comes home. Violence comes home. Violence repercusses and ricochets in ways that we often don't appreciate. And as my colleagues in the audience can tell you, we in the academy have often spent a lot of time thinking about the legacies of the 1960s on the left and not enough time thinking about the legacies of the 1960s on the right. One of these legacies is simply the way that this event and the changes it engendered, the event being the decade of the 60s, sort of have these long ramifications that shape later events and later currents that run through American history. In other words, although my book is sort of like the first historical wide view take on this movement, the white power movement, this is not a new story. What we lacked was sort of a apparatus for understanding and putting these events into historical context. One thing to think about is that Oklahoma City, the bombing in Oklahoma City, and this is on my mind today because of the explosives that are going through the mail. The bombing in Oklahoma City is the largest deliberate mass casualty event on American soil between Pearl Harbor and 9/11. It's an enormously significant event. But we still don't have a narrative about what it was and what it meant. The memory has been distorted and muted and sort of pushed to the side of how we think about danger, how we think about where the threats to our nation lie. So part of what my work shows, and I don't have time to give this to you in detail today, but I can answer more in Q&A, is that Timothy McVeigh is not a lone wolf actor, but was part of this long social movement. And this is not conspiracy theory. This is simple social geography of his life, which connects him to not one, but several white power groups. It shows that the Murrah building was in the crosshairs of this movement beginning in 1983, that McVeigh once lived with someone who was so familiar with his target he could draw a diagram from memory, that he's using the playbook that has been circulating in this movement all this time, that he chose for the date of the bombing, not only the anniversary of the Waco siege, but the planned execution date of a major person who had targeted the same building decades earlier. It goes on and on like this. But we have this memory of the Oklahoma City bombing as this event of lone wolf or possibly a few co-conspirators carrying out an act of terror. If we think about it as part of a coherent religious and political ideology, then we have the tools for understanding something else about what this kind of violence means and how we might combat it in the future. So we can talk more in the Q&A, but I think the main thing I'd like to contribute to our discussion is that what seems new about our present moment is not new. Also, what seemed new about this was not new. We have long historical archives that can offer us possibilities and lessons on how we might confront racist political formations in and beyond our own scholarship today. Thank you. Oops. Sorry.
All right, thank you, Professor Ballou. One more paper, and then some question and answer. This paper from Professor Furman Dieberbrander, I hope I said that close to right. I try. Who's going to talk to us about echoes of 1968 in the gun rights movement. Just to introduce him, Professor Dieberbrander is a professor of philosophy at the Maryland Institute College of Art in Baltimore. He's author of Spinoza and the Stoics, published by Continuum in 2007. And also a book, Do Guns Make Us Free, published by Yale University Press in 2015. He's also published short pieces in the New York Times, the Boston Globe, the Washington Post, the Atlantic, America Magazine, and the Los Angeles Times. Professor Dieberbrander.
Thanks. Hi there. Thank you for having me. I hope you can hear me okay. I am decidedly low-tech, so you have to use your imagination when you listen. It's old-fashioned. And unfortunately, I do have some numbers to throw at you. I hope they're just sufficiently vivid that they burn in your memory. That's my plan. So in many ways, the cultural rift laid bare in 1968 is still very much with us today, reverberating in our political ecosystem, motivating voters and social movements in similar ways. I think in particular of Nixon's silent majority, the middle and working class whites who are resentful of the social change afoot and wary of losing their historically privileged position. By the way, I'm a philosopher, not a historian. I took that thought directly from Ken Burns' documentary that I've been watching over and over again on the Vietnam War. It's excellent. But while I was watching it, I was thinking that the support and the elevation of Nixon, which was deemed a backlash against the massive, boisterous, in some ways threatening shows of popular mobilization evident in the anti-war movement, prominently displayed right here in Chicago at the Democratic Convention, that we still hear this today in many different ways. This silent majority was resistant to the social and political advances promised by the civil rights movement. And as Dr. Stamen indicated earlier, concerns over criminality were a code word for race then as now. One prominent channel for this lingering race and class resentment today, issued along similar fault lines as 1968, is the gun rights movement, which I've spent some time researching over the last few years. The gun rights movement has become increasingly radical and intransigent, and in many respects is a repository of white, male, working class anger. Demographics indicate that clearly. Not the anger part, but the racial makeup. In fact, I'm going to argue that this movement is more about expressing this anger than it is about guns. Guns are just a stand-in, a symbol, a proxy for other issues and concerns. Gun rights supporters look to make a statement rather than weigh in on sensible gun laws. How do we know? Because by sometimes large majority, they actually favor individual gun-safety measures, but then they rally behind the NRA. Cultural call to action. Conservatives sympathetic to the NRA are endorsing something other than the God lobby's radical agenda. First, a word about this radical agenda. We're seeing a high tide in the gun rights movement with some of the most permissive and expansive laws in our history. This includes campus carry, which refers to laws passed by 10 states and counting since 2006, which allow students and staff to carry guns on public university campuses. The radical NRA agenda also includes stand your ground laws, passed by 23 states only since 2005. These laws allow you to shoot another person if you feel he is threatening to your life and well-being. You no longer have the obligation to flee, but you may now stand your ground and shoot. Predictably, this legislation has resulted in a slew of unnecessary killings when shooters misjudge the threat before them, and this unfair law disproportionately punishes African Americans. In the past decade, furthermore, 11 states have passed permitless carry. As the name suggests, this law allows people to practice concealed carry without a permit and no safety training at all. As a general outrage, most states lack universal background checks, thereby allowing criminals to easily buy guns in private sales. More recently, with a sympathetic administration, the White House, the NRA has sought to make it easier for average citizens to buy armor-piercing bullets and silencers. The NRA likes to suggest that its legislative agenda is all very traditional and very American. This could not be further from the truth. It has been pushing this radical agenda for only the last 20 years, when the nation actually had a ban on assault weapons, and the NRA president voiced support for modest gun safety measures, including universal background checks. Consider our real gun heritage, briefly. According to legal historian Saul Cornell, who teaches at Fordham. In colonial America, he tells us, citizens were required to have a firearm in order to fulfill their civic duty to serve in a local militia. Thus, gun ownership was a collective, not an individual right. In turn, colonial Americans were required to store their guns safely and take care of them. No states currently have safe storage laws today. And the guns of colonial Americans and their safe storage was subject to inspection by authorities. And they were required to demonstrate that they could use their firearms effectively. So, very different, very far from permitless carry, which the NRA calls constitutional carry. Thanks to NRA efforts, the nation's arsenal has ballooned over the past decade and now stands somewhere between 270 and 310 million guns. So almost one per citizen. Over the same period, the NRA has used a reliable playbook. With each mass shooting or President Obama's electoral victories, it has warned of impending gun restrictions or outright bans, and we see people surging to buy guns. The NRA has been utterly dominant over the past decade and has not felt the need to compromise or moderate its position. By contrast, it has become steadily more radical and has not suffered for it. Yet, that is. The radical stance of the NRA, aided and abetted by gun rights advocates and by the electorate more broadly, I will soon explain, is strange if you consider a few facts. For one thing, while the nation's arsenal has swelled thanks to unprecedented gun laws, it turns out that gun ownership is remarkably concentrated. A recent study by Harvard and Northeastern Schools of Public Health, they found that fully half the privately owned guns in America are owned by 3% of the gun owners, so-called super owners, who have on average 17 guns apiece. Be careful with them. The percentage, I think I live near one, the percentage of Americans who own a gun has actually fallen over the past 20 years, from 25% of the population to 22%. And the number of households with a gun has fallen by a third since 1970s. More troubling for the NRA, gun ownership among the youth has plummeted, and hunting, a traditional bellwether of gun ownership, is falling in popularity. What this means, of course, is that a very small minority of gun owners is the real beneficiary of the NRA agenda. But most Americans feel very differently about gun regulations. 90% of Americans, including upwards of 70% of conservatives, support universal background checks. 74% of non-owners and 67% of gun owners favor allowing lawsuits against negligent gun dealers. Negligent gun dealers. Right now we have a law that Congress passed at the NRA's behest prohibiting such lawsuits. 74% of non-owners and 50% of gun owners favor child access prevention and safe storage laws, which we do not have. And 80% of non-owners and 78% of gun owners favor preventing sales to individuals with temporary domestic violence restraining orders. Only a few states have that. The NRA has successfully rebuffed all of these legislative efforts, which are in many cases supported by a strong majority of non-owners and gun owners alike. So what's going on? One explanation is straightforward. The NRA is a powerful lobby that exercises its influence smartly and ruthlessly. It corrals legislators and gets them in line, bullies them. But there is another explanation too. There is a notable enthusiasm gap between the forces of gun rights and gun control. The former, the gun rights advocates, though small in number, are much more passionate and assiduously, religiously vote the NRA's agenda. But the same cannot be said for the moderate masses that favor gun control. Ironically, in my book, I called those masses the silent majority. Maybe that's why I was invited today, because it evokes Nixon's silent majority, although from the other side, completely. When I was referring to the masses, the silent majority, I was talking about the majority in this country who favor gun safety laws, but do not vote that way, or at least they don't vote that way consistently. They're too easily distracted, or they don't hold their legislators to account. But the gun rights people, they're not like that. They are single-issue voters, and everything is about the gun. And a gun equals freedom, and everything is contingent on that. Now, a large chunk of the moderate masses who say they support gun safety laws are conservatives. What has been repeatedly borne out is that if you ask them about individual gun safety laws, they will express support, NRA members included. But if you ask them about gun control more broadly, they reject it. One of the most galling incidents, on the Comedy Central's The Daily Show, they sent one of their correspondents to the NRA convention, and he went around asking people how they felt about universal background checks, and they all said they were for it, and he said, but that's gun control, and they said, that's not gun control. So gun control is a dirty word, but what makes it up, not so much. So the NRA has succeeded in doing something here. It's succeeded in making its position a pillar of conservative thinking alongside deregulation, climate change skepticism, and low taxation. Since the 1990s, and especially under the leadership of Charlton Heston, the gun lobby has insisted that gun rights are part of the culture wars. Liberals want to take our guns, just they want to relax criminal justice laws, permit an influx of immigrants, and undermine family values. NRA rhetoric channels and goads profound cultural anger on the right. Consider some of the fiery speeches from the NRA's chief cheerleader, Wayne LaPierre, who some of you may not know also went to a Jesuit university. He went to Boston College, my alma mater. I was dismayed when I discovered that. Any case, Wayne LaPierre happily incites class warfare and issues openly racist insinuations. He echoed Nixon's call to the silent majority when, in his speech endorsing Donald Trump in 2016, he told his members that they have to take their country back. Quote, "We at the NRA hold dear what makes us uniquely American. Family, responsibility, patriotism, mutual respect, honesty, civic duty. These values are still alive in this room," he said, "but there are other rooms. Rooms where the America we see is no longer visible and no longer wanted." He then proceeded to list a host of racially charged notions like failed border policies, failed education policies, and failed criminal justice policies. He even saw fit to mention efforts to restore voting rights to 44,000 ex-cons in Maryland and 206,000 convicted felons in Virginia, inciting concerns of minority voters streaming to the polls. In a speech in 2014, I believe this was at CPAC, he said that gun control was undermined citizen protection against, quote, "Mexican drug gangs operating in more than 1,000 cities, the 20,000 gangs with at least 1 million members embedded coast to coast, and the 100,000 street gangs documented in Chicago alone." I don't know where he got that from. Does that sound remotely close? 100,000 gangs in Chicago? I doubt it. But I did not do a fact check of his speech. I do apologize. You can. Add to that, he goes on, that volatile mix, the thousands of hardened, dangerous criminals that are being released from prisons all over America, When states can't or won't spend the money needed to imprison their criminals and those prisons become overcrowded, the courts set them free. This is still him talking. On top of that flood, add the waves of criminals of all kinds who invade our country from the south. And LaPierre sought to remind NRA members of the many protests that have degenerated into, quote, riots, looting, shootings. How many times have we seen crowds turn into angry mobs after court decisions and natural disasters that collapsed civil order? So he sees hordes of dark-skinned others threatening us in every corner. This is the rhetoric that resonates with ardent gun rights supporters to inspire defense of gun rights, and it infects the broader electorate, stoking racial fear and resentment. For his part, Charlton Heston liked to point out how gun owners are roundly scorned by the liberal media and political establishment, which sees them as social retrogrades, told to sit down and shut up and let the forces of progressivism pass them by. Heston saw a target population that was the casualty of a social revolution, a besieged demographic, on the verge of being sidelined, its interests eclipsed, its welfare receding. With the symbols of their indignation and alarm in hand, their guns, they would stand up and scream, "Stop." For Heston, the gun was about asserting one's refusal to give ground in the social divide. "From my cold, dead hands," that's what he said, as he remembered, but he was referring to the gun. For gun owners and many conservatives sympathetic to the cause, guns are a powerful symbol of resistance. They express cultural power, anger, perfectly. There are many memorable sayings from the gun rights movement, but this one is salient to this talk. Quote, "The Second Amendment is like a gun held to the head of the government." In theory, this means to say that citizens require the Second Amendment to overthrow a tyrannical government. In actuality, it reads like a threat. And NRA supporters would like to issue a threat to cultural and political opponents, social enemies, and the government, which supports minority civil rights. In his book, Gun Guys, journalist Dan Baum crosses the country, spending a lot of time talking with avid gun owners, gun sellers, gun manufacturers, and those who practice concealed carry. He noted that the gun guy demographic has suffered many indignities in recent years, stoking their anger and securing their attraction to the NRA message. Writing in only about 5 years ago, what indignities does he have in mind? Quote, "Many in the bulge of the gun guy demographic hadn't seen a real wage increase since 1978. Job security gone. Employer-provided health care gone. Pensions gone. House underwater. Gun guys, as Baum calls them, quote, had their livers pecked out while women, immigrants, blacks, and gays all seem to have become groovier, sexier, and more dynamic players in American culture than they were." Unquote. This segment of the population, the gun guy segment, and those sympathetic, feel that their lot is precarious and search for security. Guns do that. They offer a notion of control. They offer a notion that I'm taking things into my own hands, that I am responsible, self-sufficient, and upstanding. These notions speak to the broader population, of course, and the anger that Baum describes is shared by the rest of the white, middle, and working class. Thus, gun rights talk of responsibility and control, the autonomy that guns give a person with regard to his security. This speaks to people who feel they are no longer in control of their destiny and becoming increasingly dependent on government munificence. Note that Baum wrote this before the Trump phenomenon, which also captured this demographic and channeled white working class anger. It was no mistake then that the NRA was Trump's richest donor, giving him $30 million. He was a culmination of all that the gun lobby had been saying for years. In many ways, the NRA's arguments against gun control make no sense, as is evident upon minimal reflection. The gun lobby says teachers should practice concealed carry. This will deter school shooters. And yet, at Parkland earlier this year, and at Columbine, armed guards were present and neither deterred nor stopped the attackers. The NRA touts the civic value of responsible gun owners. These are the good guys who alone will stop armed bad guys. But then the lobby advances permitless carry laws that don't require gun owners to be trained and responsible at all. Ardent gun supporters also like to argue that citizens should be armed to stand up to tyrannical government, just as our founding fathers wanted. But this is the height of insanity. To think that these armed individuals will stand up to the U.S. military, which is the richest, most sophisticated on earth. I suspect the most convincing argument for gun owners is that guns make them safe, though public health data readily attests otherwise. The NRA has very successfully obscured public health findings for the larger population. For the most part, arguments for permissive gun laws and pervasive gun ownership make little sense, nor are they historically founded. The NRA is rushing us headlong into an armed society with permissive gun laws that the nation has never tolerated before. NRA calls for an armed society are not rational. They are not sensible, realistic, or plausible. But that is hardly the point. Gun rights arguments and the fiery rhetoric issued by LaPierre and Charlton Heston, they are an irrational call to arms which plays on racial resentment and social insecurity. Thank you.
We have about 15 minutes for some questions. Anyone?
Ellie has her
I
hand
know.
up. Oh. You can have this other person.
No, no. Yeah, there.
Hi, guys. Thank you all for your talks. Don, I have a question for you, actually, as you were talking about victimhood and how that has sort of changed as well post-1968. And I'm wondering if you can speak to that, and specifically the subgroup of survivors from victims, and how that resonates with our current climate and the Me Too movement, not thinking of the social media movement so much as what Tarana Burke's original movement was for, which was a space to allow survivors to lean into that story and have that be more prominent.
Sure. I'll do my best. I'm not, is this on? Hello? Can you hear me? I am leaning in and speaking. Can you hear me if I just talk like this? I'm not a victimologist, so I'll apologize. I'm apologizing a lot for my lack of knowledge about so many things. So I'll speak to the best I can in the way victims have been used in criminal justice policy, primarily through the 1980s and into the 1990s, and less so now. We're in a movement to rethink the way we think about victims in criminal justice policy. So I hope I can answer your question. I wouldn't say that it was about victimhood in the 80s and 90s when we talk about, and even back to the 70s when we talk about crime policy. The use of victims was for political purposes then, and for much of that time, it's the attaching of names of victims to particular crime legislation that made it very hard to argue against it, even if it wasn't good policy. So things like Jessica's Law, or some of the other laws that create these really long mandatory life sentences for different crimes, by attaching a victim's name to it was hard to argue against it. We've stopped doing that to the large extent in the last 15 years, and because I think the victim rights movement didn't see that as particularly helpful, right? So it's the use of victims as a prop, which is how it was used for much of the last 40 years. Now we're incorporating victims into our discussion of policy in a different way, so that the legislation that we pass actually helps them, and is not just seen as, say, vengeance for what they have. I'm sorry, I'm being long-winded because I had thinking through it as I talk. There has been a push of late to see the criminal justice system as one that's responsive to victims. So for most of the last 40 years, the way we incorporated victims into policy was thinking that all victims wanted vengeance, and that we should respond by passing laws that just make sentences longer and make people suffer more. That has given way to a new approach that is responsive to victims and takes a restorative justice approach, where victims are incorporated into policy so that they address what victims need and what they want, not just thinking that all victims are the same and want vengeance. And I think you're seeing that now with movements around Me Too and things like that, to incorporate ideas like we should listen to what people want and not assume that they just want vengeance. I hope that answers your question as best I can. Thanks.
So I'm glad Don brought up the question of vengeance again, because it's actually my question for the whole panel, is that, we have a really long title for this panel. I can't even remember what it is at this point. But I think I'd want to ask the panelists if they thought the theme of vengeance is something that could bring this entire story through. One, in the case of not just the vengeance about what are the spikes in the violent crime. The assumption is that it's African Americans doing, which is of course not the case, not at all. But the vengeance also about that spark in prison is going into your thesis. But I also wonder, with Kathleen's fantastic work, is there this sense of vengeance for the white GIs coming home? They're getting a joke of a GI Bill for the first part, and we're also coming into the 70s. The 70s stagflation starts earlier, obviously, but a stagnant wages, a real decline in the probability of them achieving the American dream of doing as well or better than their parents. So even if they are truly middle class, there's significant downward mobility for these folks. And that sense of vengeance for the assumption that minorities are getting the hand up or the hand out, whatever it is that they want to do. And what do you do then? Your weapon of choice of vengeance is the actual gun. And I'm not sure if that's too ham-handed to try and pull these things together and what you think about that idea.
I can take a crack at that one. Is this working? In the back? Okay, so there's a lot of parts to this. One is that when we think about extremism, I think it helps to think about how diffuse the impact of an extremist movement can be. Because the impact, the movement that I'm looking at is very, very small. It's a fringe movement. We can think about it in concentric circles. So there's like 25,000 people in the 80s who are in the hardcore inner circle of the white power movement. And those are people who live and breathe and work in this movement. They've dedicated their whole lives. They marry within the movement. They get most of their social relationships are inside of that circle. And then outside of that, there's another 125 to 150,000 people who are less involved than that, but sort of send contributions, attend rallies, buy literature, distribute things, do some grassroots kind of work on that outer ring. And then outside of that are a whole bunch more people, 450,000 people, who don't buy the literature themselves, but read the literature regularly, right? Social movement theorists are familiar with this model of organizing. And we might think about this because there's then another ring around that circle of people who would never read a Klan newspaper, but might agree with some of the ideas that are presented in one, right? Especially if they come up through friends or over dinner at someone's house or informally or somewhere where it's not being written down. So these ideas move and impact mainstreams. So one of the things that's happening with white power is that it is a opportunistic movement that is diffuse in that way and is bringing people from the outside to the inside using precisely these currents of discontent that you're naming. Some of them are economic, some of them are racial, some of them have to do with a sense of fear, a sense of anger, and it's different in many cases for different people. Okay, so that's one working engine of change. And we could overlay that on sort of a larger history of capitalism or history of economy, look at the 20th century, which would tell us that the GI Bill after World War II really did distribute wealth, but it also created this idea among many people that they got what they had through merit and hard work, rather than this massive government handout that in fact created the conditions for success that were never going to be in place for people coming back from Vietnam, absent other advantages. So yes, there's a ton of discontent in the 70s that's going in all kinds of different directions. Okay, is one piece. The other piece has to do with the way that what white power is doing is very similar to what early iterations of the Ku Klux Klan had done, which is to use the prevailing winds to recruit and mobilize. So again, the easy corollary, the easy way into thinking about this is the Klan of the 1920s, which is classically anti-Black and anti-Jewish if you're in the South, but it's also anti-Mexican if you're on the border. It's anti-labor if you're in the Pacific Northwest where there's a lot of unions. It's anti-immigrant in the Northeast where there are a lot of immigrants, and it's anti-Catholic in Indiana where we have Notre Dame and people in fisticuffs between Notre Dame students and Klansmen, which is one of the great 20s stories. But they have always had this model of activism where you can ride in and sort of tune your rhetoric and your hatred to the prevailing winds in order to bring people in. And then once you're in, there's this system of sort of curating hardcore activism and public-facing activism both that work together. Okay, and then the other part of this is that what the Vietnam War narrative is changing over time as well. And here I'm using the work of people like Patrick Hagopian, who have argued that this idea of the war that we are now really familiar with, it's in every Vietnam War movie and most memoirs and writing about the war, where it foregrounds the veterans' experience, the wrongness of the combat, the sort of it's the apocalyptic scale of violence, but also the sense of meaninglessness and unwinnability. And it does those things, historians have argued, in a way that looks like it is apolitical, but actually really occludes the opportunity for anti-war discourse and tamps down anti-war speech. So what the Klan is doing in the 80s is using that idea of Vietnam to do this opportunistic recruitment, right? So when they're talking about the way that when they're talking about the way that they're mobilizing this sense of vengeance, they're picking that up from the Vietnam War narrative. That sense of vengeance is the undergirding narrative trope in like every Vietnam War story in the 80s. And they're using that. Now, whether they're using that because of genuine feeling or whether they're using that performatively is the thing that's really difficult to know from the historical archive. So going back to the example of Louis Beam, I have him talking about his diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder, and a lot of his writing is sort of emblematically PTSD symptoms, and one of those is having those kinds of numbers of weapons and hyper-alertness and a number of other kind of earmarks. But whether he is in fact diagnosed or whether he is using that as a recruitment speech is very difficult to know. And he's an excellent public speaker, and he's able to mobilize these prevailing winds very effectively. That said, vengeance, yeah, if you did a word cloud of the writing produced by this movement, vengeance is everywhere. But I think that that's true of all kind of, how would we classify this? I mean, I think that's true of many other spheres of right-wing activism in this time period, and certainly within kind of, some of the gun rights materials that my fellow panelists have talked about as well.
Yes.
I wanted to ask about explicit connections between the white power movement and the National Rifle Association. It's my understanding that the NRA, going back, was a hunters group. It was a place where if you cared about hunting, you could bring your kids, you could go hunting together, you could train your kids how to hunt, how to use a gun responsibly. There are, it ties into parts of rural America where you needed guns to shoot, animals, wild animals. I mean, there's a whole life there. And the NRA was not historically, as I understand it anyway, an opponent of reasonable gun laws. And then there's a moment when they change, and a really strong element of their rhetoric, as you said in your speech, is we have to be able to defend ourselves against government tyranny. We have to. It's all that same rhetoric, which, I agree, seems insane against a government that has missiles and helicopters and everything else. But it's right there in the middle of it. If you listen, that's what they talk about, and it ties into notions of freedom and all that, which in turn means that what people like me think of as reasonable gun laws are seen as somehow violating fundamental liberties that go back into American history. Mm-hmm. So it seems to me that there is some direct cross-pollinization in there, but I don't know when that happened. So that's my question.
I'll speak to part of that, but I'd be very curious to hear what Kathleen has to say, because I did not focus on the history of the NRA with respect to, and specifically with respect to its tie over to the white, not white nationalist, white power movement. I mean, it is, when I wrote this book, I I said I'm going to avoid any talk of race as well when I critique this movement, because I felt that was kind of a cop-out. I wanted to just take it, I'm a philosopher, so I just wanted to take it head on the merit of its arguments, which I did. But it is really not hard it's very soon you see the racism that is inherent in many of these calls to action. Wayne LaPierre's speeches are just the most egregious examples of this. I feel inclined to urge you to read them, just to see them, and you'll be surprised. I don't say that happily because it's not pleasant, but it's amazing, what he says. But what I wanted to say about the history of the NRA, what I do know is that it used to be a hunting organization for training hunters, and then in the late 1970s, I believe it was 1977, 78, at their convention in Cincinnati, they had a coup. And the hunting contingent was overthrown. They were replaced with a group that were interested in advancing, they were interested in civilian gun ownership. And out of this group comes the Wayne LaPierres and the Charlton Heston. And, I was quoting Charlton Heston, and then I realized there's students here, and I don't know if they may not know him. He was an actor. And he was the head of the NRA in the 1990s. And
Come to our film fest next week. We're playing Planet of the Apes on October 30th.
Right.
Charlton Heston.
That's him. No gun in his hand, but that's him. He was Moses. That's right. But when he was the head of the NRA in the 90s, that was like they were almost liberal by comparison, because they were officially in favor of universal background checks. So 1978 is the coup, but as I was trying to argue in my speech, the radical turn has been much later, early 2000s. I think it's demographics. They know they're in trouble. People don't want to own guns in the way that, they used to, and they're just doing everything they can to expand the market as fast as they can. That's all I'll say to that.
So you mean demographics of gun owners, declining gun owners? Because I think the other way to think about that is demographics of race.
Yeah, that's what I meant.
Yeah, I would just highlight that. My book used to have this whole section on why it's important to study the fringe and what the fringe can tell us about more mainstream mobilizations, and that section got struck after Charlottesville because the things that I write about in this book are now like squarely in the middle of our public discourse again. I think that this question of how, historians have this category, historical empathy, which is the idea that part of our job is to figure out how to read the archive and understand how to make sense of the thing we're looking at. So not to rationalize what someone like Louis Beam is trying to accomplish, or to justify it in any way, or to hold space for it in your heart in any way, right? Not that kind of empathy, but the kind that lets you look at someone's record of speech and action and understand how for them it would make sense given their historical time and context. And I'm sorry if this is remedial for a lot of people in this room, but just to put us all in the same place. So I think one of the things that the study of the fringe can do is to extend historical empathy to political ideologies such that they can cast light on the things that in the mainstream don't make any sense or appear insane, right? So the white power movement, two things. The short answer is there's no way to know this because the NRA won't release their archives. The long answer is the white power movement for sure has crossover and a Venn diagram with the NRA. And more importantly than that, it shows us something about how the ideological underpinnings of some gun owners work. Not the entire thing, and I'm not trying to paint them both with the same brush, but to a white power activist, there's a list of things, hold on a minute. So you gave us as a list of values that Wayne LaPierre is talking about. The list of reasons to own a gun includes protests and riots, maintaining civil order, gun rights, fears about immigration, crime, family values, and gangs, right? To a white power activist, all of those things are connected to this specter of racial apocalypse, which is not, it is a more extreme version, but that's not that's not a unconnected idea with the idea of demographic overrun, right? Which is how this appears in more mainstream conservatism a lot of the time. The idea that the reason that people are opposing abortion, interracial marriage in this area, or forced integration, LGBT values, I said immigration, but the reason that all of these are hot button issues for people who are in the white power movement is because they're all thought of as ways that people are interfering with the birth of white children and the propagation of whiteness itself. Now, the people that I study have very extreme ideas about this, and it's attached literally in Christian identity belief, for instance, to the idea that there is no rapture in Christian identity, and the faithful are going to have to actually man the front lines before Christ can return in the end of days. It's a direct apocalyptic religious ideology. They either have to survive, or they have to, in fact, work clearing the world of non-white people. Okay? Now, that's not to say that everybody in the NRA thinks that, right? Not even everybody in the white power movement thinks that. This is all bits of interlocking things. But I think there is a way that looking at the fringe can sort of inform that our understanding such that there is an imaginary that is real to people, in which it is not crazy to think that enough people having guns could theoretically overthrow the most militant superstate in the history of the world. In the white power movement, that's accomplished in a dystopian novel called The Turner Diaries that lays out a whole strategy for asymmetrical warfare by which a few gun owners are going to gradually awaken the masses, seize a few select nuclear weapons, and then use that to overthrow the world. And it lays this out as a thing that could happen one day. And it's fictional, but it becomes a touchstone for a lot of people in this movement and in the NRA. Like, they sell that book at gun shows still. That lays out exactly this thing, not as insane, but as a thing that could be accomplished. And I will just kind of, since we're at a 68 symposium, a lot of people on the left believe this too, right? Like, this is Maoism, this is asymmetrical warfare, this is the idea that a small number of armed citizens can overthrow a more powerful military. And of course, then we're back again to Vietnam.
I think we have to wrap, just to stick to time. Elliot, do you want to say anything in closing to?
Yes, I do.
Yeah.
I want to say one thing that's been on my mind lately, and it relates to all this, but not so directly. It was always so odd when he came down that escalator and talked about Mexicans as rapists. What was that about? It kind of was not part of the stereotype. Having grown up in California, I knew the stereotypes. What was that about? Well, what it was about was the old stereotype of African Americans, of course, that African American men are dangerous, they're rapists, we can't trust them with a white woman. It was re-invoking that for those who understood the stereotype and applying it to someone else. Those are the days we live in. Thanks for coming. It's really great. It's really great being alive. Let's hear it.